So welcome everybody to our first online session. We were going to come to Wellington and do it together. This is our shifting of it online, so it is a bit experimental, a bit like this morning's session, to understand how well some of these things translate into the space, but it also provides the opportunity for people to join us from all over instead of just one location. So that's really awesome too, and have a much wider capacity for people to just drop in no matter where you are. So that's great. The topic is not a straightforward one, grappling with the concept of equity, and we're trying to share as genuinely and challengingly as we can where we're in this kind of big stuff, which is big stuff that everybody is working with, but we're just going to share a kind of slice, but we're just going to speak honestly into what we're learning and where our feet are on the ground. And the invitation is for you guys to do the same in your sessions, and for us to be kind of collectively finding our way through these things that are actually really significant systemic issues, but also at the end of the day about how people act and the choices that we make. So we're just going to share some of what we've been learning and working on, and I'll give a bit of more context to that in a second, but we hope to create some space for shared conversation around that. So if you're just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. We look forward to your critical feedback. We're all at different points on the learning journey. Just enjoying Jackie's puppies. And this is this opportunity. The lab wants to host these kind of sessions to connect people. So it's just as much about connecting across different agencies and places when you go into the breakout rooms and stuff as it is us just sharing. So we're trying to, share ideas, but really just as a provocation for others to connect in and share their own in the smaller group sessions as well. So there will be chances to do that. There's people from all over on the call today, which you'll see coming up in the chat, which is awesome. Quite a few different agencies here. And I'll just quickly overview of the session so you get a sense of it. We're just going to spend a little bit of time naming the big things that we mean when we say equity. The strategies that we're developing or testing or learning about for starting in different places, different start points. And it'll become clear what I mean by that as we sort of go through and unpack that. An opportunity for the group to unpack that together in their own way, where you guys are coming from on this stuff. Hopefully we get time for a little break, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how we think about tracking change then if our start points are different. So if we're kind of trying to do stuff differently, then what are we looking out for? And hopefully in some capacity have a conversation with you all about what this means for the readiness of the public sector for this kind of innovation, and we can unpack that term a little bit as well. So that's the nature of the session today. So please use the chat to connect with each other, to put ideas, to put thoughts, to put questions, and that is kind of a shared space for us to operate in, as well as the video part of the session. So we're just going to give a little bit of background about where we're coming from, so there's some context to what we're sharing, and then we'll get into the work a bit more. So I'll just quickly, who is the co-design lab? Excuse me. This image is absolutely not to scale. The lab is a tiny little dot in the middle of all this, but the co-design lab, we're resident in Auckland, in Tāmaki, nested in the Southern Initiative in South Auckland, but we're half a local council and half central government. So we have 10 central government funders and partners as well. So we occupy this little space between working on the ground with the Southern Initiative, with communities, the lived reality of what's going on for people, making and trying and testing stuff, but connecting that back to what's going on inside at national policy level, and doing our best to try and create an opportunity to learn, to share, to build capability, and to help create some connection between the policy intent and actually how that's lived on the ground, and some dynamic between that. So that's just a synopsis of the lab. And Angie's going to talk to the Southern Initiative, which is the Southern and the Western Initiative, sorry.
Yeah. So the Southern Initiative is a part of Auckland Council, and it's one of 2 place-based initiatives. So our remit is around social innovation and understanding what do we need to do differently to support better outcomes for our whānau here in South Auckland and now West Auckland, and even beyond that, actually. So some of our big sort of focus areas include tamariki wellbeing, up-tempo, youth economy, and we're doing some pretty amazing, our colleagues are doing some pretty amazing work in terms of Māori economy and supporting Māori businesses as well. What does that mean? What does it mean to think about what we need to be doing differently? It means that we think about what we can enable in community, in place, and how we use different knowledge systems, how we support whānau to lead their own change, how we think about spaces and things like social capital and social connectivities as alternative responses or different starting points to traditional traditional systems responses. So in short, our job is to think about what are the new norms, and that what we've been talking about more recently are what are the different starting points, or what are the new starting points to begin to address the big issues that contribute to inequity.
Put some other context in. All of us on this call will be working in different places and have different contexts and different capacities for influence and change. And so we occupy a particular space. We only can do what we do because we do it in partnership with other groups, with agencies, with whānau, with schools. So we just have the more space than they do to share on this stuff, and in some cases we can be a bit more honest about the challenges because we're sort of sitting in an in-between space. So it's learning that we only can share through the generosity and participation and mahi of others. So just to kind of name that, and then we're lucky that we have the space to try and also cultivate some conversation around that. So just to recognise that we're only able to do that because of the generosity and the bravery actually of the others that we work alongside, and that the context for everyone will be different. And some of this that we're sharing today, we haven't tried to articulate it like this before. So again, really open to critical friends' feedback. Some of it we're going kind of bigger than we normally would, and I don't know honestly why we chose to go big on the webinar instead of like more simple and small, but I hope you can give us some feedback about how well we navigate this. But so some of the things are probably things that maybe people might say, oh, well, in our context it's different. And what we've tried to do is share our context, but then hopefully draw it back to some practical things that are things that can land or be explored no matter where you are. So hopefully we've struck a balance there with that. So I'm just going to now invite you for yourself to have a reflection, literally just 30 seconds to take in this question. And if this question doesn't suit you, you can think of another one. But about how much your mahi lets you grapple with the big issues of equity. Awesome. So now, there's a million different ways that you could respond or feel about that question, but now we just want to create the opportunity, because we're not in a room together, we can't have a cup of tea, but we can still meet each other and make some connections. So we're just going to take 5 or 6 minutes to go into a small group. Please introduce yourself to the person that you, or the people that you're in the room with. Say hello, share who you are, and if you want to unpack a little bit about that question of how you feel that your mahi lets you grapple with the big issues of equity, or you can just say hello and have a chat about where you're at. So we'll give you a few minutes just to meet other people on the call, understand who's here, build a bit of a connection away from the screen. Kia ora.
Kia ora whānau. Hopefully you had a nice kōrero with your rōpū.
If you have the opportunity or are able to, we're really keen to see if there was thoughts that came up in your chats and intros just then. So please capture a thought or reflection from that conversation in the chat. And then Angie is going to start to kind of unpack a perspective on the context in which we're working and talking about equity. Hi.
Kia ora whānau. The first thing I want to say is that what we're offering really is in the spirit of sharing, and we know there's lots of people doing amazing work with our whānau and inside systems. So a big mihi to everybody who's grappling with this work, and we're sharing what we're learning. We're still learning, and it will evolve. And we hope the things that we share, we offer might be useful in helping people think about how they grapple with these issues of equity in their work too. So what's on the screen, the apology, this is my screen, it's got lots of words on it, is the way that we like to conceptualize all the big issues that contribute to equity or inequity and across multiple spaces. And one thing we hold really at the centre of our thinking is how power and control is showing up in all of these spaces, and how do we intentionally share that power and control with our whānau, with communities. And one of the key things about our mahi and our team is that we are really connected to place. And so when you look across these spaces in the diagram, we are really connected to our community and our story of place. And we think about these, I don't like to say levels because I think that's hierarchical, but I will say these three spaces where we're focused on whānau outcomes, setting systems, and also power and influence structures. And so for us here in South Auckland, we're really focused on how we support equity through whānau-led innovation and how we empower whānau through the process. What sits in that space often is, as a traditional response, is a deficit intervention or crisis response for our whānau. And what we're learning and what's emerging as we think about, I think, across all of these big issues, but also the spaces, is that we think there's more opportunity to support a strength-based approach around social capital, social connectivity, whānau strengths and spaces as alternatives to traditional systems and service responses. And so when I think across the three spaces, I'm thinking that each of these spaces has the potential to begin at a new starting place, or to balance or rebalance what's contributing to inequity, or what can contribute to equity. And so in that whānau space, what we're thinking about is we've got a whole lot of resource energy going into crisis intervention. Also, how do we think about investing in our local ecology, community ecology, and whānau strengths? And then in terms of the system setting, we're thinking about the power of the system to legitimise itself and its own responses, in the way that it configures resource, but also in the way and what it measures. And what we are trying to think about is reimagining how the system can value, invest in different things than it is at the moment, and how we can build some space inside of those system settings that allows for alternative responses to whānau and a less binary systems response. And then when we get up into the sort of power and influence structures, for me, it's about how we're understanding post-colonial structures that either continue to perpetuate inequity or begin to address colonisation and intergenerational. Thanks, Penny. Intergenerational trauma in the way that it's responding. So thinking across all of those spheres and thinking across all of those big issues, and holding this to be true, that we need to be grounded in place and empowering whānau, and holding the big stuff like colonisation and trauma, and challenging the power structures and systems that either embed that inequity or can potentially address equity, and how we're supporting whānau or how we're empowering whānau at the moment. And so that's a lot to grapple with, right? That's a lot of thinking. There's a lot of big things, a lot of big concepts. For us here, it means that we're developing an innovation methodology, and I like to say it's a whānau-led innovation methodology when we're working with whānau to empower whānau to create their own local fit-for-purpose solutions, or to build on the strengths that they are identifying for themselves for equity. So what are the alternatives, or what are the other starting points where whānau are empowered for their aspirations and to do things differently when we're thinking about alternatives to the traditional responses. And we think about that in a way where we're guided by tikanga, and we also use design methodology in terms of phasing in the work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. And so broadly as well, we're thinking about how are we triangulating different knowledge systems. And we think about mātauranga Māori, we think about lived experience or whānau voice, and also Western science. That in itself is a new starting point, because often, for example, mātauranga Māori or even tikanga is not acknowledged inside a system as a legitimate knowledge system in itself. And we like to acknowledge those knowledge systems and contextualise it for our people so that they can see themselves in the process. What's the next one? Oh, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the tikanga and how that guides us in the work. And I also, just before I go into that kōrero, I just want to acknowledge all of the our rangatira in this whose work I draw on to think about this. I'm thinking about Fiona Cram, I'm thinking about Leonie Pihama, I'm thinking about Nan Wehi Peihana, and of course Linda Tuhiwai Smith at the moment, ngā mihi kia rātou. And so I just want to preface this by saying I've really been privileged to draw on a whole heap of amazing work and a whole heap of amazing thinking about tikanga and how it can show up in research and other spaces. And then what I've tried to do is think about how we contextualise it for design. I won't go into each of these tikanga, but I'll say each of them are so deep in themselves and they're interrelated. We think about how tikanga guides us in the way that we are, how we can be in the process, but it also starts to guide us in terms of what we're prioritising and then what we value. So that's a different starting point for us. And that helps us to think about the way that we're interacting with whānau and empowering them, but also the way we're working with people inside of the system as well. Design helps us to grapple with the complexity of people's lived experiences and system, and it provides an equity lens for us because we're able to hold all of that stuff you saw in the diagram before, hold it broadly, and what that helps us to be able to do is to recognise structural issues or challenges rather than seeing an immediate need or a deficit that we need to address for whānau. It also helps us to think about, when you think across those three spaces, is what we're doing in all of those three spaces, is it compounding inequity or is it driving equity for our whānau? So I'll just give you a couple of examples about for the tikanga itself. We've done some work with Plunkett here in Manurewa, and the result of enabling these tikanga in the work meant that we were able to support whānau to tell us what they needed in space and what was important to them, and what emerged from that practice and that support of the whānau was that the whānau talked about how incredibly important space and healing and support in space is, not necessarily through service. And that gave us a really, really good opportunity to reimagine not only what the space in Plunkett could be, but what the spaces in our public spaces such as libraries and council facilities could be. And what they told us was that there were 5 basic things that need to be in space for whānau to feel welcomed and to be able to support their tamariki and to parent and to be in a space. Plunkett had 1 of the 5. And some of our council facilities had none. And so it really helps us to reimagine how those spaces become places for whānau to be together, connect, where they're not looking to be engaged by a service, they're just looking to connect with other people and be within their community. That piece of work has been adopted by our Māori Outcomes team and also by our community facilities directorate. That means in terms of impact, what we're able to do is to work across our network of facilities and reimagine and rethink what needs to be in those facilities for whānau, to be able to use them in a way that suits whānau and meets their aspirations. In terms of design, we've just done some, as an example of how design can help us, we're doing some work with whānau and Papakura. And what designs helped us to think about is to reimagine what protective factors are for whānau. So what whānau and Papakura were telling us, which is my community, it's where I live, is that they are socially, some of our whānau, not all, some of our whānau are socially isolating themselves because they see it as the only means of control and power that they have. They do not have trust in the system, they do not have trust in their own community, and some of them don't trust their own whānau. So the only thing that they can do is isolate themselves. The system often looks at those people as avoiding, hard to reach. When you think about when you ask whānau why, you start to understand that as actually they're making some logical and rational decisions based on what their past experiences has been. The system view of whānau is actually very different to the reality. And actually, how do we build on what they're using as strategies themselves instead of saying they're not complying?
In the sense of how these principles guide interaction through, we may be drawing on design as the process, and it's got some useful bits and pieces, and not really phased about what we call it, but what's useful for us in terms of unpacking or whatever. The grounding of it in principles and values shapes everything about the decision making about what things look like and how they feel and what matters. So, for example, an expression of manaakitanga will be around how do whānau want to participate, how do they want to act, how will they feel ensured that they're made to feel welcome, that there's reciprocity, that they can express their own leadership in the process, that they can lead and share back in their own way, that the way that things are constructed suits the needs of whānau and their families, whether it be practical things like timing or whatever. So it comes to life as a way of shaping the entire process and investment and things like whanaungatanga. So it means that there is a sort of idea of how we might progress, but the way in which the practice occurs is based around an expression of these values and principles. To develop together a kawa at the beginning of the process about what matters and how people want to show up and how they want to hold each other accountable. So those things are part of the way of working. From a Pākehā perspective, I can only conceptualize them as sort of values and principles. So my engagement is much more shallow than Angie's is, but it's very much led from the values and the importance of the nature of the engagement, and also the outcome that produces those. So that reshapes, that manaakitanga becomes how you operate, but also what is produced as a result and what is valued for people. And so when whānau is saying what's important about the space, they will express what their experience of manaaki is or not, if that's not what they're experiencing. So those concepts are really powerful as holding, guiding, and also the direction of travel. and design gets weaved in as it's useful as a tool for unpacking things and reframing things, making complex things visual. So I just wanted to give a bit of concreteness to how that shows up.
The thing I'll say is that when I look across those, and those aren't an exhaustive list, they're things that are guiding us at the moment, they're likely to be extended. Whānau for me is the cornerstone, and we do not value whānau as institutions. None of your personal KPIs are about understanding where that person comes from, what is their awa, who are their children. But it's that kind of trust that needs to be developed to do some of this really challenging work. And in my mind, that investment in genuine connections with whānau and the social capital and connectivity it builds as a byproduct, because a lot of our whānau aren't connected to each other in our community, is really, really critical. And like Penny says, I like to think about that these principles are not only the mechanism, the way you work, but also the outcome itself. So we use whānau as a process of connecting well with each other, and the outcome is whānau because now these whānau are a positive peer network and they support each other. That's beyond the work. All of the stuff that we do, it's never about a project, it's about sustained connections with people and sustained positive outcomes for people, like pro-social connections, social capital. So, and that's just the way that we're doing it. That's not what we're trying to actually test or put up.
Yes, someone's just asking, can we share about the 5 important design features? So we can definitely share more about the 5 minimums and some other aspects of the outputs of that work. So just to build a little bit on what Angie's saying, and I'll expand a bit more in terms of examples of working in this way with whānau and rangatahi on different initiatives and kaupapa, whether it be around wellbeing and attendance, which is one of the things we talked about this morning, or the mahi that Angie's talking about with plunker, which then has grown into looking at the concept of creating home with all of our facilities across council, particularly libraries. The design process consistently reveals where in the system the barriers are compounding for people and making things worse. So it always shifts our gaze to the structural conditions. Are the conditions for well-being here or not? So it's inherently lifts our gaze to the conditions and the structures, away from expecting that individual fixing or solution fixing. So that's how we use it as that kind of lift up. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we learnt with whānau and rangatahi when we're going through these different processes and contexts. So, okay. So just kind of building on what Angie shared before, how does this, we're in our minds thinking about how does the wider ecology of communities, of people, of networks of this place either compound inequity or support healing and rebalancing, build equity. And in our minds, we're always thinking about how to extend past the default response of services. And this is not an anti-service kind of thing. That's a paradigm that lots of us are in. There's lots of really important services, but run by people who work just extraordinarily hard and are just completely committed. And it's a structurally limited response to the challenge that we have, and it's a structural process of investment and configuring of funding that requires people to operate in a certain way. And so lots of people may be delivering services, but very often the work that they're doing isn't, within the scope that they're contracted for. They're doing workarounds, they're moving beyond those things. And so we're looking to expand the focus, the system's focus, always on that structure being the response to something systemic. So we're just going to talk a little bit about this idea of trying to reveal, like lots of you will be working in this space as well, but it's that visibility consistently of the system which often snaps back to the service response. So when we talk to whānau, we know that, this is well established, that as a general rule, the services that we have don't meet lots of people's needs, and in fact going and experiencing a service can compound the challenge. You leave feeling ashamed or judged, or you've got to do a whole lot of things, go through a whole lot of hoops. It's often actually it just compounds the structural racism, or it compounds the inequity and disparity. So there's doubly reasons why they're not serving people in some cases. We also know that the supports that people find useful include supports that are often not shaped up like the way that we fund services. So that might include natural supports of whānau, hapu, communities, networks, sports clubs, as well as Indigenous responses that are often not, and in some cases I think, you know, there's really amazing examples where they are, but they're often not legitimised in our current te iwi system. They're generally things that people are doing outside of the funding services. So we know there's heaps of other ways that people want to and engage in and are effectively supported. Whoops, going backwards. Okay, so we also hear from whānau that they want spaces to heal and spaces to rest and have respite, and they proactively seek those things out, but whether those spaces are available to them or not. And often our current system waits for you to fall in crisis before you can access anything. It assumes you have to go through this sort of prevention cycle of prevention, early intervention, crisis intervention, and then you can get to healing and restoration. Whereas actually the lived experience that we hear for young people in whānau is that at any point in time they might say, the thing that I really want right now is actually to sort out some of the stuff that's going on for me, and then I'll be able to do these other things. So working with parents of children, that's where they want to start, that's their start point, and they're proactively seeking that, but it tends to be that we can't provide any supports until people have fallen into a crisis space. And we look at a library, and a library could be a healing space, but what we hear from whānau is that quite often it's not, because it's not set up to be a responsive, welcoming space. So the status quo for lots of our spaces, and I know that this is, you know, for lots of us, this is things we know, but this is just us laying out sort of context for us, is that our social health and community spaces are not neutral, even though we might think of school as a neutral space. Well, we know from the conversations that we've had before, and in particular this morning, there's a huge shadow of structural and institutional racism that hangs over those institutions, that for people like myself as Pākehā may feel like it's a neutral space, but that's not the case. And we need to be really proactive about how we rebalance those, otherwise they're perpetuating. So sometimes all people need as well is the opportunity to build social capital and strong social connections to rebuild a whānau, and our services, spaces and environments could choose to foster that, or they could not. So some of our services could be much more about building connection, responding to people. Our libraries, our facilities could be about spaces to foster social connectedness, but our current way of thinking about responses carves up a little service or a program, and it has sort of usually a single intervention idea about an individual. It doesn't just say, yeah, we'll foster, you know, we'll really invest in social connectedness, and actually people will find their own ways and opportunities. So these are sort of potential for all the other places we could be investing and working in. So these are the things that we're trying, and I know many others are too, with whānau and practicing ways that they can occur and embedding them in the system. So similarly, you know, we can invest in our environments and in ways that acknowledge trauma and help to rebalance, but we have to be proactive and intentional about it and not assume that a space is neutral. We also know whānau want to support each other, and they totally have the capacity to do so, but at the moment, again, that's not sort of a legitimate space of support. We don't see that naturally. Opportunities to lead and to be heard are healing as well. So again, if we were proactive about that, that's not a service, it's a way we think about designing our spaces, our environments, our interactions to create opportunities to lead and opportunities for people to be heard, to grow their own capacities, to lead their own responses.
I think that's like a critical one for us, is that whānau are never, there's very few invitations for whānau to lead, to be rangatira. There's lots of opportunities where we're offering to support or help whānau, but one of the most powerful things that we prototyped in Papakura was whānau leading our prototype and leading support and being viewed by the other whānau as leaders, and the confidence and the pride that the whānau feel being recognised as rangatira in their own right, in their own community. And when I think across our traditional systems and responses, we don't really, there's not many invitations for our communities and for our whānau to be rangatira.
So we will have an opportunity soon to sort of break out and share and chat about this. We're just going to kind of go to the next step where it's, well, where does this thinking land and learning that and trying alternative things that we're doing with whānau take us at a sort of, I guess, conceptual level. Oh, sorry, the last one. Support and strengths come most from friends, networks, people and places that we trust. So when we look at that, the potential of the ecology to support the ecology is huge, but our focus is so often so small in the service space. So in a way of conceptualizing this, I guess it simplifies, but for us we've found it useful to try and articulate this. I'm testing it a bit with folks, is that if the blue dot is our default service response, what helps doesn't need to be a service, and there's actually a much wider ecology of support that could be available for people that the system doesn't necessarily recognise or respond or support, including natural, indigenous, whānau to whānau. There's a number of different ways that supports show up. Many of our significant spaces aren't neutral, and in order for them to become strengthening or healing spaces, we need to be really proactive about rebalancing them in a way that's trauma informed, that's culturally grounded, indigenous led, and that we can think about that through whether it be schools, health systems, libraries, and I mean, we know a lot about, how that shows up in health system, but also that people want spaces for healing and they seek that out for themselves as part of their own processing. And it doesn't need to be going back into the blue dot space in order to go and build healing. These things are a focus on shifting systems conditions to build people's capacity. So it's on the system to think about how it changes itself to enable these, not on people to fix things that they're doing. So it really requires us to be quite vigilant about retaining that systems view, that broader view of all the places, spaces, behaviours, messages, languages that are available to us as a government system, even just to reinforce positively instead of just thinking there's a problem, what's the service that will fix it? And I know I'm oversimplifying a bit, but so these are inward changes, system changes, looking at side of the system and saying, how is the system enabling, strengthening? How is it legitimizing and providing broader supports? How is it proactively engaging and rebalancing spaces for healing? So those are new habits for us. We don't often hold ourselves accountable in that way as government. We're quite good at contracting out things for other people to do and then deciding whether or not they've been done well or not. So this requires us to do a lot more internal critique, conscious kind of reflection.
I think too, I know there was a comment about interagency, and often we've got, in parts of the country, we've been doing it for a while, and some parts we're sort of just getting going around a good interagency responses to crisis. But my challenge is what would good interagency response look like for wellbeing and healing, not just reacting to crisis. Not saying that we don't need to do that, we do, but the danger for us is that if we keep focusing on crisis, that's the only place we'll ever be, and the effort that's going into that, somehow we have to rethink about how we respond proactively to healing and well-being and to aspiration. Otherwise we're gonna be caught on the crisis wheel, I think, and we're trying to do something different around that in Papakura with the Social Wellbeing Board and some wonderful people there. But it's really, when I think about the potential of the resource of the agencies that are coming together for crisis and what it could be used for to help people be well and heal with an abundance mindset, I think that's a really good opportunity for us.
And it's the concern that well-being then is defined only in the crisis space. Right.
Yeah.
So the little mental model for us then is these three, lost how to drive it, is these three things as a kind of way of thinking about designing. Means these three things are active in all our places and spaces all the time, and they offer us different start points away from just that sort of blue dot response. So it's a, when we're thinking about schools, we're thinking about how are they healing and strengthening as well as responding spaces. We're thinking about libraries, we're thinking about how are they healing and strengthening as well as possibly places that you can go for support. And that those things need to be as strong across all three, whereas at the moment we have a very lopsided kind of perspective on a program or a service response to something. And so we just try and hold this as a way to make visible that shared responsibility for creating the conditions for wellbeing and the enormous scope that all of our different teams and agencies have for environments that commit to these three things, not just to the programmatic response. I'm worried that I'm oversimplifying it now, but so we just wanted to share this really as a provocation for all the different mahi that you're all doing. Probably, you know, there's lots of bit of preaching to the converted, but we're trying to find strategies to hold this systems view wider, because we do have those default, all our mechanisms default us back to that blue dot. So the invitation now is to just spend a bit of time, and the conversations will go where they go depending on where you're at and what you're thinking about. But again, go back into the smaller groups and just think about, well, are there ways in which these things are already active or could be potentially active in your own world? And that might just be, it's not everything we've talked about, it might just be, you know, working beyond services and thinking, okay, well, how are our spaces and ways of working and behaviours doing these things? It could be about challenging the idea of neutral spaces and thinking about the rebalancing and healing. It could be about, are we focusing, you know, on structural conditions in some places, not just on the services within them? And how well are we doing it, that looking inward to ourselves and thinking, oh, well, how do our behaviours and our structures and our policies and our conditions actually set the scene for different kinds of outcomes? So these are just sort of different start points than maybe that we often start at for thinking about responses to things. So pick any one of those as a start point or not, and I'm just going to see if Brooke has got time to just paste. Put some, oh yeah, great. So there's some the prompts are there in the chat if you want to return to those, if it's any of those four things, and we'll just invite you to spend a bit of time reflecting, sharing, unpacking, and then we'll come back in. Kia ora.
Kia ora whānau. I hope you guys had the chance to have a good kōrero.
You could just take a minute or two and just drop some of the thoughts into the chat, and we can start to collect some of the thought bubbles and conversations that are happening across the group. So just take a minute, and if there's some thoughts, reflections, provocation, or questions that came out of your conversation or from the kōrero so far, it would be great if you could just add something into the chat for us. Awesome, that's really great seeing those thoughts come through. So do feel free to keep adding to the chat. It's really helpful to share and as a way to contribute to that kind of collective conversation and just seeing the different things that came out. So thank you for that. Whatever is a useful thing that you take out of it, as opposed to thinking that everything that's kind of shared needs to be somehow digested or of value. I guess different things will stand out for different people. So just pull out the things that are useful. Cool, we'll get started again. So I just first want to acknowledge that there's some really, really cool stuff in the chat, because one of the things that we are, I guess, constantly feeling the, I don't know if inertia is the right word, and people have named in the chat, but it's like the big things and the little things. And so it's really awesome to see people's concrete examples of how they're integrating little things that are really, really significant, whether it be language or building in investment in relationships, whakawhanaungatanga in all interactions, and just thinking about that. So there's some really awesome concrete examples of how people are really trying to be intentional about that rebalancing, and about which I think to me that's really powerful, because otherwise we can feel quite overwhelmed and think, oh, it's all too hard. And quite often what design approaches do historically is they talk about scope and they de-scope things, and we quite often do that in our projects as well. We go, oh, it's out of scope, it's out of scope, and what that means is that we never end up addressing the real issue, because we always say it's too hard, it's out of scope, and we come down to something that we feel we've got influence in. So I think it's really important that we are operating from a point of view where everything is in scope, but sometimes you're progressing in small ways, but you're keeping an eye always on the big issue. So you may not be able to resolve everything inside the shape of the thing that you're working in, but you can absolutely build intentional modeling of different practice each time you work. So that big and little tension, I think, is really well illustrated in the examples that people have shared. So thank you so much for putting that in there. It's really exciting to read. And we'll come back to some of those things about small, and I guess not small is the wrong word because it minimises them, but I guess within readily available in our everyday practice when we come back to this question of readiness at the end. So I'm going to share a bit more. If it's all just a bit too much and it's too late in the day, just let it wash over you, and I'll just talk to a couple of things that we just want to share because of the sort of, I guess I'm hoping they've got a practical application for some people. And then we just wanted to close with a little bit of time, just this question of readiness for innovation and what that means. And people have already, in a way, started talking into how that shows up in your work. So I'm just going to share a little bit about how we think about what we're tracking and what we value and what we're being really intentional about in our practice, given that we're trying to create different start points with different outcomes and have that sort of mindset of rebalancing. And so partly because what we track and what we measure have such a critical effect on our behaviour. So I'm just sort of sharing this as an explicit activity. Sorry, no, I'm driving the wrong screen. Very technical setup. So we think about outcomes in three ways. The first is outcomes for whānau. So we're working with people on the ground together to explore issues, to understand things, and then to test and apply possible alternatives and responses. So the Plunkett example was one. And the MOE work is another example that we talked about this morning. And some of the things that we look for in terms of outcomes for whānau in their language and the things that they've identified as critical are things like, is there more opportunity to step into leadership? Do people feel a sense of welcome? Do they feel confident? Are they able to take up new opportunities? That might look like something like, as a result of being part of the process of design and creating something new, they might have started to engage in their kids' kapahaka at school. They let their kids do kapahaka. They've got more confidence to engage in a social ecology where they may have been nervous to do that before. So those kind of indicators are significant indicators for whānau, feeling like they're able to make decisions that are important to them. Are there stronger social connections? Do people feel like they've got stronger capital? They've got people to go to. They can access opportunities that might translate into things like taking up opportunities to be on a board of trustees or take leadership in their community. Those things are capacity, capability, opportunity, confidence increases that whānau say are important to them. At the same time, we're looking at things like, keep touching the wrong screen, the changes that are occurring in the local system. So with the partners that we're working with and the collaborators that we're working with, whether it be services or our community facilities partners, what changes are going on inside their policies, behaviours, spaces or practices? Are there, and someone named this in the chat before, is there a change in language? Do they talk about users or they talk about whānau when people are coming in? How are they thinking about people only in terms of how they fit into a service criteria, or are they thinking about them as part of the community that they're engaging with who have a role to play in the space? Is manaakitanga and relationships valued in the space? Is there time given to that? So for example, like the Plunkett example, they shifted to having someone out the front of house welcoming people when they arrived and invested in that as a role because they understood how critical it was for a bunch of different outcomes. Whereas traditionally we might think, well, why would you need someone out the front? That's not what Plunkett's for. Are spaces and policies more responsive to the things that whānau told us were important? So, is the library shifting the way that it offers things or opens things or shares power with whānau around defining the space? Is it thought about as a shared asset rather than a government asset. So we try and track all those kinds of changes in our local system. Yeah.
This example came to mind as Penny was speaking there, and that was when we were doing the work with Blanket. One of the shifts, the mindset shifts for the team who were working on site was that when someone came in the door, they saw that person as a prospective playgroup inductee, or they saw them as coming to the well child check. They viewed them from an institutional or service perspective. They saw them as people coming in to access what they were delivering. They didn't see the space as a space that could be nurturing, healing for whānau. So the shift was that once we'd done the co-design with the whānau, they now see them as equal partners in their well-being. So they see them as driving their own well-being and aspiring to what they want for the future as equal partners in the space. They don't see them as okay, we've got to make our numbers, so here's a person that I can get onto the play group and then get my numbers up. This is another webinar, but there is a wider cultural issue for us as a public service and how we respond and our mindsets and our culture and how we see power and control and how we grapple with things like institutional racism. When we're doing some of this big work with big organisations like Council and like Plunkett, that's one of our biggest system barriers and challenges.
Yeah, I just will note that some of the things being described in the chat really talk to this, that in some ways some of these things sound straightforward or really obvious, but actually what they take is a real vulnerability. They actually require people to actually be in really uncomfortable spaces, and that includes us. And so it's although there's big system things, there are also people things, very, very human people things, and that's just as significant a part of being ready and the readiness of for this kind of innovation, if we want to call it that, as anything else. So for us, what often happens, and this is maybe relevant for some people and not others, but there's always that tension between working locally and sometimes quite small, and people say, but how does that connect to bigger change? Like, what's the connection there? And we're constantly trying to, I guess, run the connection between little and big all the time. And so one of the ways that we think about doing that is that these changes in system, and these are just examples, they're not an exhaustive list, but occur at different levels. So we look really locally at the group and place that they're working in now. So that might be one location of a space. And we also look at across the wider system. So for example, if we're working with Plunkett has the capacity to take something national, which they did in this case. So they were able to say, great, that's working for us, that set of principles or that idea. We're now going to try and share that across all of our sites, or the majority of our sites. And then of course there's a slightly higher level which comes more, I mean, it doesn't have to be this kind of hierarchy, but which might be national policy or legislation. And how our work interacts with those things, and we're constantly trying to understand how to be more connected in this way, as are many others. But we find that sometimes the things can scale all the way up, and they do connect. So for example, the Plunkett and Creating Home ones are examples where we've done something locally and then there's an opportunity for the system to adopt that right across the space. Other times the work on the ground with people in action and context requires you to do a sort of detective work back up the system to find out, well, why is this thing stuck in place like this? And sometimes that leads to a change, and sometimes it leads to an understanding of a barrier that's much higher in the system. And you have to do this kind of going up the food chain to understand. An example of that might be you're trying to do work on the ground with service providers, and a challenge for them is they're only paid for contact hours. So they can't do any kind of reflective practice or think about how to operate differently because they're not funded for that. They're only funded for when they're sitting with someone in front of them that's a client. That's a massive problem if we're going to try and shift how we work with each other. But when you follow that all the way to the top, there is no contracting guidelines anymore that require people only to be paid. I'm just picking an example, but a lot of the layers of the system believe that that's the case, but those kinds of constraints around commissioning were removed several years ago, and we should be able to move freely, but why can't we? Why are those kind of barriers sitting in the way of us working differently? So sometimes it's almost like a detective work to understand, is this actually a policy setting? Is it a legislative setting? Is it an interpretation of a legislative setting that's stopping us from being able to collaborate like this or commission differently? And then it's moving back and forth to say, okay, yeah, if it is a system setting or it's a mindset or a belief, how do we demonstrate what alternative looks like, or build the capacity in the system by working together to operate differently? What COVID did and the lockdown did was a whole bunch of lived experience of operating differently. So now many, many more of us have the visceral experience of just operating on a much more values-based discretion, decision-making basis. And so there is now a much more tangible lived experience of that kind of responsive decision-making sitting in the public sector than was there before, which we think we can capitalise on. But the process of working together to try things is in and of itself a modelling of a new way of practice. And so that builds capacity in the system too. So the action of doing it together helps people think about how we'll work together, and that has its own kind of flow-on effects, which is what people are providing examples of in the chat as well. How we work differently together ourselves, it has an effect more widely about the system's capacity to feel vulnerable, to respond to some of those more human things about admitting that we don't know, being wrong, being open to other people's expertise. Those things are all building a system readiness for a more responsive way of working.
Our systems are not geared to recognise their own failure. They're designed in a way that they'll only reinforce their own responses. But I think there's a really interesting parallel in terms of people showing their vulnerability and systems being able to show their failure. Because we've got a whole heap of stuff that is working, and we've got a whole lot of stuff that's not working. It's not been working for a long time, and we're just stuck there.
So the third thing, which you might not see pop up there, is that the third thing that we track is what we name as strategic learning outcomes or practice-based evidence. So it's the stuff we're learning as we go about what's holding things in place, or what works, or what doesn't work, or the reframing that we hear. So things like understanding, a different understanding of what protective factors are for families. Those things constitute the learning outcomes of the process of working together. And so that stuff we try and codify and share as well, which is part of the trying to capture the change process. So we've just shared that as a kind of match up to the idea of, well, if you're starting somewhere differently, then you're probably paying attention to different things as well. So it's an example of how we're thinking about distance travelled. So what I want, I'm actually not, I won't do this now, but there's like a question that you can ask, and it's already been raised and it came up this morning as well, is what's valued in your world and what are we tracking? And for whom is that important? And are we looking at the things that the system as a manager of resources considers to be important, or are we understanding also the difference, the things that make the difference for whānau? So that quite critical lens on what we're reporting, what we ask questions about, are a real leverage point for rethinking about how we configure our system resources.
And even how we shift into investing in those things now. So the things that you saw Penny talk to on the slide before this one, when we observe the emergence of these things as being important to whānau, the way that we work with them and the way that we think about what needs to be different and what we might prototype, we build it straight in. So they move from being insights around what's important to things that we are actively investing or supporting in as part of the process.
We're going to shift for this last 20 minutes into this question of systems readiness. And I don't know exactly how we're going to do this, but we'd like, because people have already started putting some really great stuff in the chat, so we kind of want to put to you guys, and maybe we start by putting stuff in the chat, and there might be an opportunity to hear from a couple of people too, but we just start by kind of thinking about it individually and writing a few things down, because it just helps with the processing. But we've talked about different kinds of start points and holding this tension of big and little, then needing to pay attention to different things. People have named some really awesome kind of behaviors and start points and ways that they're working in this kind of how we would think of as a rebalancing mode. I'm interested in people's reflection, and people have named some of the barriers too, of what our collective readiness is for this kind of innovation. I mean, to be honest, we could get rid of that word entirely, but as we discussed this morning, it's not innovation related to shiny things or silver bullets. It's, if we're talking innovation related to equity and systems, then it is the stuff about humility, about creating space, about power sharing, about slowing down. Those are really different kinds of ideas of what actually where innovation comes from. But those are the kinds of things that will let us reconfigure the system resources in a way that are much more meaningful. So I'm interested for people to, I'm just going to see what the screen says next. Yeah, for people to have a think just for themselves for a little minute around how you feel, you know, your team and your environment, what kind of readiness is there for that? What kind of challenges are there? What are some of the start points that you might already be activating or kind of trying to cultivate to build our collective capacity to shift in these ways? So I'm just going to hold that thought. I'd love people to put stuff in the chat, and then maybe if people want to, we could just hear from a couple of people on their reflections on this. So we'll just pause for a minute while people have a time to kind of process and think and reflect about that.
Cool.
Christina.
Kia ora. I just wanted to start by, I'm spotlighted, saying thank you for your kōrero this afternoon. It's been really inspiring, and I've enjoyed everything that you've said, and also the opportunity in the breakout sessions. I think one of the big things for me that I was just thinking about, and I did put it in the chat just now, but kind of to expand on it, was I really like something you just said then, and it was quite simple, but it was the idea of changing what we value now and changing what we measure so that the innovation will come. So we don't need to have all the solutions and all the answers to where we're going to end up, but that by putting the right values in place, that the right systems, and having different conversations and measuring different things, that will in turn create the innovation. I just thought that was I really enjoyed. I just thought that was really valuable and tangible, and something that I can take forward. So kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora, Christine. Thank you for sharing. Kataraina, did you want to kōrero?
Ora, tātai ake he mihi noi ho kia kōrua, I whakatakoto I tēnei kōrero mā tātou. Just a mihi to you both for allowing us to be in this space with you guys. It's a lot to take in, so I'm really glad that it's recorded. Personally, for myself, I work in justice, and we're currently working on innovative court projects. So these workshops are particularly interesting to me. And I just wanted to touch on I think it's more of a question. How do you believe mātauranga Māori can be integrated into the way we transform our justice system in terms of the co-design process with iwi, with local iwi?
Are we talking about it now?
Do you want to?
Quite. That's a big question, but the way that I would think about it is, and of course, if you're working with iwi, it will be iwi-led, but the two ways I think about it is, number one, if you're co-designing with whānau inside a system, the innovation process needs to be whānau-led, and that needs to be tikanga-driven. So the practice of it needs to be tikanga-driven. And then if we think across the three spaces that we've talked about this afternoon, it's ambitious, but I like to think about the tikanga being what you're doing and tracking and prioritizing at a system level too. So yeah, so it's tikanga led in terms of the practice and how you will be in the process, and the system's got to legitimize that in the practice, but in the way that the system values it as well. So we don't want to be doing these little discrete co-design processes where you get some whānau in and you talk to them and you get a prototype and it's finished. a lot of this work is about the system change that occurs by working in this way with whānau. And one of the ways I think is useful is to think about how you're getting the system to sign that off at a strategic level and at a system level, so that you've got both happening. Otherwise, you have choice work with whānau,
And
choice
then it goes.
types, but the other stuff doesn't embed.
Mm-hmm. Kia ora.
For me at TPK's, probably the ongoing frustration is the fact that no matter what ministry, no matter what government agency, that investment is designed, it's pre-designed before it's even gets anywhere near whānau, hapu, iwi. And so our people are continually being expected to meet criteria that, we can do that. We've spent 170 odd years doing that. But it is real, it's a real dynamic. And so where we're talking about whānau-led, responding to whānau and all those concepts that are integral to co-design, we still, here's an example for you. I noticed my general manager isn't present in this one, so I'll be okay until he finds out what I've said. No, it's all right, I'll say it nicely. But we have an investment stream where at the moment, and because it's COVID purpose, and I'm sure you're all in this space, but we have this investment scheme where the outcome is to be able to reteach and have skills that are passed on to whānau. Now, when I go into the space, what whānau are saying particularly across West Auckland, which is where I'm centred, but because I grew up there and that's the whānau that I know, but the voice is we want to stay safe. That is the call of our whānau at the moment. It's why we have high absenteeism in schools. It's not just around child choice to not go to schools, because their whānau don't want them to go. And so they're staying home, and so we have increase in family harm, and that's the dynamic that we're facing. The whānau voice is we want to stay safe. I'm having to talk to them about an investment and how are you going to pass the skill on, And look, we've all learned to literally play the game. We know how to fill in the paperwork. We know how to steer what is important to us as Māori people to the man, to the government man, to the government space. That's why I really enjoy being part of the kōrero that Penny and Ange hold, and they hold them quite frequently, because it reinvigorates me that even though they're little steps, they're really small steps in terms of the big machine. I've got to remember when I complain about standing in Manurewa and looking at, to one side, ki te taha matau, a kura kaupapa that looks like it should have been bowled over yesterday, and then ki te taha maui, another kura that's as flash as, and it will continue to be flash as, ia marama, there'll be another new fancy piece put on it, and I watch my brother's kura fall over, Well, I've also got to remember and celebrate that 30 years ago we didn't have kura kaupapa Māori. So, it's about what are the achievements, what are the things that we celebrate along the way. And as I'm turning into a wee bit of a pessimist, but along the way we've got to remember to actually stop and say, actually, we've done this. Actually, we've achieved that. And they might be really small moves, but they've become a whole new aisle for our people.
Can I respond to that? Ngā mihi. Yes, we're on the kura kaupapa journey too, and it's challenging, but it's blinking worth it. I just want to say that we've been talking about some of the most powerful things you can do inside the system is just to say no. And what we're clear about is when we say whānau-led, if it doesn't look like what we're saying is whānau-led, if it's just a bit of whānau in a hui, and we might take their thoughts away, then we say no. And some of that is around this work. What are you prepared to put on the line for this work? Because change is messy and uncomfortable, and it really takes some guts into stuff. So we're I think lucky to really hold fast to if it doesn't look like it's going to serve whānau and it doesn't look like it's empowering them, don't do it. It's not worth it for whānau, and it's not worth it for us in terms of how we are implicated into that mahi.
Oh, tika. Just in response to what are the, what keeps the status quo in place for us? What I've seen is we justify the status quo. we know it and we've seen it work sometimes, but so when we think about this new way of working, it's untested in our space, and so everyone gets scared because in our mahi, if things go wrong, they go terribly wrong and hit the 6 o'clock news, and then that has an impact on the wider whānui in our organisation. So it's that risk aversity, but at the same time, we could be doing something different over on the side here and growing it out and out, which is what we are doing. So and that's in terms of holding us back too, like just fear of making a mistake and not and the unknown. And some of the questions that arose for me was, what is manaakitanga? What is whanaungatanga? According to who? Equity and partnership. It's us saying what that looks like. But have we actually asked the whānau, what do they think equity looks like? These are things that we've been doing as an organisation. I'm not dissing my employer, by the way. I think they're also, otherwise I wouldn't be working for them. And new starting points, what we've been practicing on the ground is how we are as individuals to each other first, because how can we go out there and propose to extend manaakitanga when we can't even do it to each other? So, aha koa he iti e. Starting from where we can. Yeah, kia ora whānau.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you so much. That was just a really rich way to end, and I feel like we probably could go for another hour listening to the different wise words that each of you have. So apologies that time was so short for the group korero. Keen that we do give you your time back at 3 o'clock as we committed to, knowing that everybody has many other responsibilities. So we'll just do the last couple of pieces, and you guys, I feel, have really offered a number of really powerful start points, as well as collectively helping name and I guess just genuinely feel the significance of what we're trying to, of how big stuff is. So it is big, but it's also, people are doing things every day, and so we're just living constantly in that tension and wanting to not put your head in the sand and go, it's too hard. And so everybody that's contributed here has demonstrated that kind of lifting of the gaze, and I feel like collectively we have to be constantly trying to do that with our partners across the system. Keep looking up, keep looking up. It's too hard, it's twice the amount of jobs. That's what it is, it's twice as much work, and that's what we have to do, is go forward and keep looking up at the same time. So I just really want to mahi to everybody that's shared their thoughts and examples of how they're doing that. And just to close off, and it's really a reiteration of what was just shared, that even though often those things feel big and they're de-scoped from us, those small acts every day are available to everyone. And I love that, Rondalyn, you're naming the care internally. How do we look after ourselves? So that was another thing that came out of the Plunkett work, was this idea of care for self, care for team, care for space, care for whānau. And you can't, unless all of those things are happening, then we're just kind of giving platitudes to working effectively outwardly. So this idea of what we're modelling internally in our team, the way we ask questions, the language that we use are all accessible things that we can be doing all the time. So we just wanted to share that as that sort of last thought, that there's so much we can do in our own space, but that was really well shared and articulated by people already. So kia ora. I think the end just says, oh, we wanted to get your feedback. Okay, everybody has to go in 1 minute, but if people do have time to let us know, and we'll ask a different way too, but if you're happy to drop a thought into the chat, again, useful, valuable, do differently next time. Love your critical friend feedback, and it can come now or it can come later, but also really hoping to continue the conversation. We will do some more, the lab is running some more learning programs that are longer than this, foundations courses. I'm going to talk to Jackie about that tomorrow, hey Jackie. in November, so over November, December, but it's a longer session, but we'll send out the information in case there's some relevancy for your team, and we're going to start doing more online work in this new world. So we'll just keep people in touch if it's of interest. We'd love to stay connected in any way, but love to get any thoughts or feedback on this session. So I'll shut up for 30 seconds in case people want a minute to put stuff in, and then we'll close. But if you have to go because it's right on 3, Kate, I understand. Yeah, cool. People are having to drop off, so if you can type, but we'll just close the session with karakia, and I'll just give a thanks again to everyone for your time, energy and generosity.
I just put it out there if anyone else wants to karakia for the advice.
Oh, Matthew, I'll do the karakia.
Kia ora, ngā mihi, ai, ngā mihi.
Kei noi tātou, kia taura ko ngā manaakitanga te mea ngā rau ki runga heo ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahi ake rā ko te huamā ki hiki, kia toi rā ko te haura Māori. Kia toi te kupu, kia toi te mana, kia toi ko tō tātou reo. Rangatira turuturu o whiti whakamaua, kia tīna.
Tīna.
Taimi e hui e tai.
Tāki.